On a crisp morning in early March, the air still clinging to the chill of winter, Lena Carter strode through the echoing corridors of City Hall with an air of quiet determination that seemed to ripple outward, touching everyone in her path. She was no ordinary figure in this grand, imposing building. She was the city's first black female mayor, a title that carried the weight of history and the burden of expectation. Her heels clicked against the polished marble floor, each step a testament to the battles she'd fought to stand here, her chin lifted, her dark eyes sharp and unwavering. Staff members paused mid-conversation, their gazes trailing after her. Some with admiration, others with curiosity, and a few with something harder to define, perhaps unease. Lena felt their stares like a breeze against her skin, but she pressed forward, her mind already racing toward the day ahead. To her, this role wasn't just a triumph to savor or a shiny badge of progress to pin on her chest, it was a duty. A promise she'd made to herself and her city, forged in the fires of a life that had never bent to hardship. Lena had grown up in a corner of the city where hope was a rare visitor, where the streets were lined with uncollected garbage bags that spilled onto cracked sidewalks, a constant reminder of neglect. She could still hear the echo of her mother's weary footsteps coming home after long shifts, her hands rough from juggling jobs that barely kept food on the table. Those memories weren't just shadows of the past, they were the fuel that burned in Lena's chest, pushing her to claw her way out of that world and into this one. She'd promised herself as a young girl, watching her mother's hunched shoulders and hearing the whispered prayers for better days, that she'd build a future where no one else had to endure that quiet despair. Now, seated behind the heavy oak desk in her new office, surrounded by towering stacks of reports and policy drafts, she felt the enormity of that promise settle over her like a mantle. She ran her fingers over the edge of a briefing document, her brow furrowing as she traced the words, infrastructure upgrades. Last night, she'd stayed up until the early hours, poring over every line, her coffee growing cold as she memorized statistics and timelines. Failure wasn't an option, not for her, not for the people who'd placed their trust in her. The morning unfolded in a whirlwind of meetings, each one a stepping stone toward the changes she envisioned. Lena moved through them with a calm authority that belied the storm of thoughts churning beneath the surface. She spoke of community programs and police reform with a voice that cut through the room. Steady and unyielding, her words painting a vision of a city where fairness wasn't just a dream but a reality carved into its foundation. She could feel the energy shift when she entered each space, some faces lit up with cautious hope, while others tightened with skepticism. The weight of her presence, a black woman daring to wield power in a place unaccustomed to it, hung heavy in the air. She didn't shy away from it. Instead, she leaned into the discomfort, knowing that true change demanded more than polite nods and easy agreements. But the real test came mid-morning, when she stepped into the main conference room for a meeting with the police department. The air was thick with tension, a palpable hum that prickled against her skin as she took her seat at the head of the table. A handful of uniformed officers stood along the walls, their arms crossed, their faces a gallery of subtle smirks and sidelong glances that spoke louder than words. Lena's gaze swept over them, unflinching, as she offered a measured nod of greeting. Across from her sat Mayo Clinic, the grizzled head of the department, his silver hair cropped close and his jaw set like a man who'd seen decades of unchallenged authority. He was a relic of an older era, one where someone like Lena, a black woman with a vision that threatened his carefully guarded world, couldn't have existed in his wildest dreams. His eyes flicked to hers briefly before darting away, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the table. She caught the faintest curl of his lip, a flicker of disdain he didn't bother to fully hide. And it sent a jolt of cold resolve through her veins. Lena launched into her presentation, her voice ringing out with a clarity that demanded attention. She outlined her plans for community policing, accountability measures, and steps to dismantle the racial profiling that had festered unchecked for years. Each word was a brick laid in the foundation of a new justice. One that served the people rather than silencing them. The residents deserved safety, she insisted, her tone rising with quiet passion. They deserved respect, not fear, from those sworn to protect them. She could feel the room's resistance pressing against her like a tide, the officers' barely concealed eye rolls and Mayo's rigid silence a chorus of dissent. When she finished, he leaned forward, his chair creaking under his weight, and fixed her with a stare as cold as the steel in his badge. "Madam Mayor," he drawled, the title dripping with mockery. "I trust you've considered what these changes might do to our officers' morale?" His voice was a blade wrapped in velvet, sharp and deliberate. Lena met his gaze, her own eyes blazing with a fire she'd carried since childhood. "I have, Mayo," she replied, her tone even but laced with steel. "And I believe that trust between the community and the police is worth more than clinging to a broken status quo. We can't move forward until we face what's wrong, head on." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging like smoke. Mayo's jaw tightened, his knuckles widening as he gripped the edge of the table, but he said nothing more. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their bravado faltering under her unshakable calm. She could sense their unease. The way her presence, a black woman unafraid to challenge their power, unsettled the foundations they'd built their careers on. As the meeting dragged on, the resistance grew subtler but no less potent. Department heads masked their disapproval in careful questions, their voices dripping with false concern for the city's stability. It was a soft prejudice, never loud enough to confront directly, but sharp enough to cut. Lena felt it like 1,000 tiny needles, each one testing her patience, her strength. She'd expected pushback, how could she not, stepping into a role that shattered every mold this city had known, but the depth of it still caught her off guard. These men, with their pressed suits and years of unchallenged sway, weren't just resisting her policies, they were resisting her very existence in this chair. And yet, with every dismissive glance, every whispered doubt, her resolve hardened. Justice wasn't a gift to be handed out, it was a fight, and she'd been fighting all her life. Back in her office that afternoon, Lena stood by the window. The city sprawling out beneath her in a patchwork of rooftops and flickering lights. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman shaped by struggle and steeled by purpose. She thought of Mayo's cold stare, the officers' smirks, the department heads' veiled barbs. They didn't see what she saw, a city teetering on the edge of something better. If only they'd dare to reach for it. She thought of her mother, her hands worn from years of labor, and the kids still playing on those broken streets she'd once called home. This wasn't about power for its own sake, it was about what power could do when wielded with care, with conscience. The lesson was clear: those who abused their authority, who clung to it like a shield against change, would face consequences, not through vengeance, but through the slow, steady march of a justice that refused to bend. That evening, as the sky deepened to a bruised purple, Lena lingered at her desk, the weight of the day settling into her bones. She knew the road ahead would be steeper, the resistance fiercer. But she also knew why she was here, not for applause or accolades, but for the promise she'd made to herself all those years ago, staring out at a world that had tried to break her and failed. The fight for fairness, for a city that lifted up its forgotten, was worth every bruise it left behind. And as the first stars pierced the night, she straightened her shoulders, ready for whatever came next. The city buzzed with a restless energy, a place where ambition and resentment tangled like overgrown vines, and Lena stood at its heart, undeterred by the storm brewing around her. If her colleagues at City Hall believed their sly digs and cold shoulders would wear her down, they couldn't have been more wrong. She was a woman forged in fire, her resolve as unyielding as the concrete towers that loomed over the skyline. That evening, as she packed her briefcase and cast a final glance around her newly claimed office, a modest space with bare walls and a single window overlooking the chaotic streets below. A quiet strength settled deep within her chest. The air smelled faintly of old coffee and bureaucracy, but to Lena, it was the scent of opportunity. She knew the days ahead would bring a relentless tide of pushback. A barrage of whispered complaints and thinly veiled hostility. Yet, she welcomed it. She was ready, not just to endure, but to lead. To carve a path through the resistance with a steady hand and an unbroken spirit. The weeks that followed her first official meeting as mayor were a grueling test of her endurance. Each dawn found her awake before the sun, her apartment still cloaked in shadow as she brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to jolt her senses awake. She'd arrive at City Hall just as the first rays of light crept over the horizon, painting the building's stone facade in hues of gold and gray. Her desk overflowed with reports, stacks of paper detailing neglected infrastructure, budget shortfalls, and citizen complaints that had piled up like dust in a forgotten attic. She pored over every line, her brow furrowed in concentration, her pen scratching notes in the margins. Meetings with department heads filled her mornings. Their voices a mix of guarded cooperation and subtle defiance. Afternoons were spent plotting her next steps, mapping out reforms with the precision of a chess player anticipating an opponent's moves. On the surface, she was the picture of composure, her dark blazer crisp, her tone measured, but beneath that polished exterior, a storm of unease churned. The resistance wasn't just a faint ripple anymore, it was a swelling wave, crashing against her with pointed stares and hushed conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room. Teresa, her assistant, had been her anchor through it all. A woman in her late 30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, Teresa had been with Lena since the early days of her campaign. When hope was a fragile spark they'd nurtured together through late-night strategy sessions and endless cups of diner coffee. She was more than a colleague, she was a confidant. A fiercely loyal ally who could read Lena's moods like a book. One morning, as Lena sat hunched over her desk, scrolling through a flood of emails, some supportive, others dripping with disdain, Teresa lingered by the door, her arms crossed, her expression tight with worry. "They're not happy with you," she said, her voice low but firm, cutting through the hum of the office heater. "It's not just grumbling anymore, Lena. It's something heavier, something uglier." Lena looked up, her hazel eyes steady, though a flicker of doubt danced in their depths. "I knew this wouldn't be easy," she replied, leaning back in her chair, the leather creaking under her weight. "Change never is. People cling to what's familiar, even when it's broken." Teresa stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "This isn't just discomfort. I've heard things, rumors from the staff. Some of them aren't just complaining. They're plotting, Lena. Ways to push back that might cross lines." Lena forced a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "We're dealing with adults, Teresa. Not playground bullies. They can resent me all they want, but they'll fall in line." Teresa's frown deepened, her fingers tapping nervously against her arm. But Lena's quiet confidence seemed to soothe her, if only for a moment. The city itself mirrored the turmoil brewing within her. Each day, as she drove from her modest apartment to City Hall, the streets seemed to pulse with an unspoken tension. Police cars dotted her route more often than usual, their lights glinting off wet pavement like silent warnings. Officers she passed on the sidewalk cast sidelong glances her way, their expressions unreadable, stone masks that hid whatever thoughts simmered beneath. Lena felt the weight of their stares. A prickling sensation at the back of her neck, as if the city itself was watching her, judging her every move. Was it her imagination, or was there something deliberate in their presence? She couldn't shake the feeling that her every step was being tracked, her every decision dissected by unseen eyes. Her morning runs became her sanctuary, a fleeting escape from the mounting pressure. She'd lace up her sneakers before dawn, stepping out into the crisp air of the park near her building. The world was still quiet then. The only sounds the rhythmic thud of her feet against the path and the rustle of leaves stirred by the breeze. She'd lose herself in the motion, her breath fogging in the cool air. Her mind clearing with each stride. But even there, the tension followed her. Some mornings, she'd spot police cruisers parked near the park's edge, their engines idling, exhaust curling into the sky. Officers stood by the entrance, hands on their belts, watching her pass with an intensity that felt personal. They never spoke, never approached, but their silent presence gnawed at her. A constant reminder that she was not entirely welcome in this city she'd sworn to serve. Each day, it pressed harder on her chest, a weight she couldn't outrun. One morning, after finishing her loop through the park, Lena returned to her apartment, her lungs burning from the cold, her muscles aching with a satisfying fatigue. She paused at her front door, fishing for her keys, when something caught her eye, a folded slip of paper wedged beneath the frame. Her breath hitched, her pulse quickening as she bent down to retrieve it. The note was small, unassuming, but as she unfolded it, her stomach twisted. Typed in stark, block letters, the message stared back at her, *, we know where you live. Watch your back. *, the words sank into her like ice water, sending a shiver down her spine. For a moment, she stood frozen, the paper trembling slightly in her grip, her mind racing with questions. Who had left it? How had they gotten so close? She thought of calling the police, but the bitter irony of that impulse twisted her lips into a grim laugh. The same force that eyed her with suspicion, that bristled at her reforms, could she trust them with this? No. She crumpled the note in her fist, her anger flaring hot and sharp beneath her fear. She'd faced threats before, ugly words shouted at rallies, anonymous letters during her campaign, and each time, she'd emerged stronger, her will tempered like steel. This was no different. She wouldn't let it break her. The next day, she tucked the note into a drawer, burying it beneath a stack of old campaign flyers, and carried on as if nothing had changed. She didn't tell Teresa. Didn't breathe a word to anyone. Admitting it aloud would give it power, and Lena refused to let fear seep into her bones. Instead, she threw herself into her work with renewed determination. Meeting with city officials, reviewing budgets, pushing her vision forward. But the unease lingered, growing like a shadow she couldn't shake. Meetings grew tenser. The air thick with unspoken resentment. She noticed it in the way certain officials, men with graying hair and practiced smiles, questioned her every move, their words polite but edged with disdain. In conference rooms, she caught fleeting glances between them, subtle eye rolls, whispers traded behind cupped hands as if she were an intruder in their domain. It wasn't overt defiance, but a quieter, more insidious rejection, a signal that she didn't belong. It stirred memories of her childhood, watching her mother navigate the same undercurrent of prejudice. The way people's smiles never reached their eyes, the way their silence spoke volumes. Back then, Lena hadn't grasped the weight of it. Now, standing in the crosshairs of power, she felt it fully. A force as tangible as the walls around her. The tipping point came one afternoon in a meeting with the police department. Chief Mayo Clinic sat across from her, his broad frame rigid. His face a mask of stoic detachment. He was a man of few words, his gray eyes cold and unyielding, a veteran of the force who'd seen mayors come and go. Lena presented her latest reforms, policies to boost transparency, to address the racial profiling complaints that had festered for years. She'd spent weeks crafting them. Her voice steady as she laid out the need for accountability, for trust between the police and the people they served. The room was silent as she finished, the air heavy with anticipation. Then Mayo spoke, his voice clipped, his tone dripping with barely concealed contempt. "Madam Mayor," he began, leaning forward slightly, "these policies could cripple our officers' morale. They're already stretched thin. More oversight will only drag them down. Lena met his gaze, her patience fraying but her composure intact. "Chief, I get the strain they're under," she said. Her words deliberate, but the community's trust is crumbling. "We can't rebuild it without holding everyone accountable, officers included. It's for their sake as much as the citizens." Mayo looked away, his jaw tightening, offering no reply. Around the table, officers exchanged glances, some smirking faintly, others shifting uncomfortably. A younger cop, wiry and brash, leaned back in his chair, fixing her with a slow, deliberate stare. "Careful, Madam Mayor," he drawled, his voice laced with mockery, "you might push too hard and break something you can't fix." That moment crystallized it for Lena, the cost of wielding power, the consequences of challenging a system entrenched in its ways. Justice, she realized, wasn't just a goal, it was a battlefield, strewn with the wreckage of pride and privilege. Those who abused their authority, who clung to it like a shield, would fight tooth and nail to keep it. But she wouldn't yield. She'd seen the other side of power's corruption, felt it in the note under her door, in the eyes that followed her, and she knew the stakes. The city deserved better, and so did she. Every step forward was a lesson in resilience, a reminder that true change came at a price, one she was willing to pay. In the dim, flickering light of the city hall meeting room, tension hung heavy in the air, curling around the edges of every word spoken. Lena sat across from the officer, her posture rigid, her hazel eyes locked onto his. She could feel the scrutiny pressing against her like a physical weight, an unspoken challenge woven into the way he tilted his head, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. Some people, she thought, bristling inwardly, didn't take kindly to being watched too closely, their every move dissected under the harsh lens of accountability. Her chest tightened with unease. But she refused to let it show, no tremble in her hands, no falter in her gaze. "Some people," she said instead, her voice smooth as glass but edged with unyielding steel, "don't appreciate when power gets twisted into something it was never meant to be." The officer's eyes narrowed for a split second, a spark of irritation flaring before he masked it behind that unreadable wall he wore so well. His jaw twitched, and he turned his head aside, pretending to study the peeling paint on the far wall. Lena caught it, though, the flicker of anger, the silent resentment, and it sent a cold ripple down her spine. The meeting dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity of veiled hostility, until it finally sputtered to an uneasy close. As she gathered her scattered notes, the rustle of paper loud in the oppressive quiet, Lena felt the weight of every sidelong glance, every unspoken threat lingering in the room. She straightened her coat, her fingers lingering on the fabric as she steeled herself to leave. It was clearer now than ever. This wasn't just about pushing against outdated rules or cracking through layers of bureaucratic stubbornness. This fight was personal. There were people here, people with badges, with influence, who'd claw tooth and nail to keep their world exactly as it was, no matter who got crushed in the process. The lesson sank deep into her bones. Justice wasn't just a principle to uphold, it was a battlefield, and the cost of challenging power could be steep. That night, Lena trudged up the narrow stairs to her apartment, her footsteps heavy with the day's burden. The hallway smelled faintly of mildew and burnt coffee, a familiar comfort that did little to ease the knot in her stomach. She slid her key into the lock, then paused, her breath catching as she turned the deadbolt twice, an extra step she'd never bothered with before. The click echoed in the stillness, a small act of defiance against the unease creeping into her life. Inside, she poured herself a glass of water, the cool liquid trembling slightly in her grip as she sank onto the worn couch in her living room. The silence wrapped around her, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of traffic outside. Her mind churned, replaying the officer's flinty stare, the way the room had seemed to close in during that meeting. For the first time, a shadow of doubt slithered into her thoughts, cold and insidious. Was this worth it? Could one woman really chip away at a system so entrenched, so fiercely guarded by those who thrived in its shadows? She leaned her head back, staring at the cracked ceiling, and let the question linger. But then, something shifted, a spark igniting deep in her chest, warm and fierce. No, she wouldn't crumble. She'd clawed her way here through years of grit and sacrifice. Fueled by the faces of the people who'd voted for her, the weary shopkeepers and single mothers who'd whispered their hopes to her on the campaign trail. They believed in her. In the vision she'd painted of a city that didn't bow to corruption or fear. She wouldn't, let them down. With a slow, deliberate breath, Lena stood, her resolve hardening like iron. This was just the opening chapter, she told herself. The road ahead would twist and tangle, lined with thorns of intimidation and resistance, but she'd walk it. Fear wouldn't steer her course. If the city's old guard thought they could scare her into submission, they'd misjudged her fire. The days that followed simmered with a fragile calm, though the air felt charged. Like the stillness before a storm. Lena threw herself into her routine, arriving at City Hall as the first streaks of dawn painted the sky, her heels clicking against the polished floors. She met with her staff, earnest aides like Maria, a soft-spoken woman with sharp eyes who'd grown up in the city's roughest corners, and Tom, a lanky policy wonk whose nervous energy belied his fierce loyalty. Together, they pored over plans to dismantle the tangled web of favoritism that choked city contracts. Their voices a quiet hum against the weight of the task. Outwardly, Lena was a pillar of composure, her smile steady, her words measured. But beneath it all, a thread of unease tugged at her, refusing to let go. She'd found a note slipped under her office door 2 days after the meeting, unsigned, scrawled in jagged ink, "Back off, or you'll regret it." She'd crumpled it in her fist, dismissing it as a hollow jab, but the words lingered, a faint echo she couldn't quite silence. Something was brewing, something darker than she'd anticipated. And it gnawed at her even as she pressed forward. It was late one evening, far past the hour when sensible people had gone home, that the tension snapped into something raw and violent. Lena had stayed behind at City Hall, her desk littered with blueprints for a community fair meant to rebuild trust in the neighborhoods long ignored by the city's elite. The clock ticked toward midnight, its hands glowing faintly in the dim office light. She rubbed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her limbs, and decided it was time to call it a night. The hall stretched out before her as she left, silent and cavernous, the usual bustle of staff replaced by an eerie stillness. Only a handful of lights buzzed overhead, casting long, jagged shadows across the marble floor. She pulled her coat tighter, the chill seeping through the walls, and stepped out into the parking lot, the night air biting at her skin. The lot was a sea of empty spaces, the streetlights flickering like tired sentinels. Lena's senses sharpened as she walked, her boots tapping a steady rhythm against the asphalt. Every sound seemed amplified, the rustle of leaves skittering across the ground, the distant wail of a siren fading into the night. The shadows stretched and twisted. And she couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her, waiting. Halfway to her car, a flicker of movement caught her eye, 2 figures stepping out from behind a hulking SUV. Their silhouettes framed by the faint glow of a dying lamp. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the glint of police uniforms, the badges catching the light. She told herself it was nothing. Just her nerves playing tricks, but her body tensed all the same. "Evening, Madam Mayor," one of them called, his voice slicing through the quiet. It carried a sharpness, a familiarity that sent a shiver racing down her spine, not the warm greeting of a colleague, but something colder, laced with menace. Lena nodded curtly, forcing her expression to stay neutral as she tried to sidestep them. But the second officer moved deliberately into her path, his broad frame blocking her way. Up close. His face was a mask of indifference, his eyes glinting with something predatory beneath the surface. "Leaving a little late, aren't we?" he said, his tone light but his stare heavy. Pinning her in place. "Yes," she replied, keeping her voice level despite the thudding in her chest. "There's a lot to do. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get home." She took a step forward. But the first officer let out a low chuckle, glancing at his partner with a look that made her stomach twist. "A lot to do, huh? Stirring up quite a mess in this city, aren't you?" His words dripped with accusation, and Lena felt the air shift, the hostility rolling off them in waves. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she held her ground, scanning the empty lot for any sign of help. There was none, just the vast, silent expanse and the two men closing in. Before she could respond, the second officer lunged forward, his hand clamping around her arm with a grip that bit into her skin. She yanked back, adrenaline surging, but his hold tightened, bruising. "Let go of me," she demanded. Her voice steady but threaded with a fear she couldn't fully mask. His face darkened, a sneer twisting his features. "Who do you think you are?" he spat, his breath hot against her ear. "Coming into our city, flipping everything upside down? You think you can rewrite our rules and walk away clean?" Her heart hammered, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm the elected mayor," she said, her tone cutting through the night like a blade. "I'm here to serve the people, not your egos. Step aside." The first officer barked a laugh, low and guttural, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You don't call the shots here, lady," he sneered, stepping closer. "We run this place, you're just a guest who's overstayed her welcome." With that, he shoved her hard, the force sending her stumbling back, her heels scraping against the pavement as she fought to stay upright. She opened her mouth to protest, but the second officer grabbed her again, his fingers digging deeper into her arm as he dragged her backward. Panic clawed at her chest, her breaths coming in sharp gasps as she realized this wasn't just a warning, it was an ambush. "Let me go," she shouted, her voice ringing out, defiant even as terror pulsed through her. But her words only stoked their anger. They exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them, and hauled her toward the shadowed edge of the lot, away from the faint glow of cameras or lights. She thrashed against them, her coat tearing at the shoulder, but their strength overwhelmed her. Their hands like iron. They slammed her against the side of a rusted dumpster, the cold metal biting into her back as they pinned her arms behind her. The first officer leaned in, his face inches from hers, his breath reeking of stale coffee and spite. "You think you're untouchable, huh?" he hissed, tightening his grip until pain shot through her wrists. "Coming in here, telling us how to live? We'll show you who's really in charge." Her pulse roared in her ears, but she refused to break. "This city deserves better than you," she shot back, her voice trembling with fury. "And you won't stop me from giving it to them." Her defiance hit a nerve. The officer's face contorted, rage flashing in his eyes. And he struck her hard across the face. The blow exploded against her jaw, a white-hot burst of pain that left her reeling, the coppery taste of blood flooding her mouth. She bit back a cry, her vision swimming, but her mind raced, searching for a way out. The second officer stepped closer, cracking his knuckles with a sickening grin. "Still got some fight left, huh?" he taunted, his voice dripping with cruelty. "Let's see how long that lasts." They descended on her then, their fists raining down with ruthless precision. Each strike landed like a thunderclap, her ribs cracking under the force, her shoulders buckling, her legs trembling as they gave way beneath her. Through the haze of pain, Lena clung to one thought. This was the price of justice, the brutal consequence of daring to challenge those who wielded power like a weapon. But even as they battered her, she refused to yield. Her spirit burning brighter with every blow. The city might bend under their fists, but she wouldn't, not yet, not ever. In the dim, flickering glow of a street lamp. The air was thick with the acrid scent of gasoline and dust as they jeered at her, their voices sharp and cruel, slicing through the stillness of the night. They mocked her relentlessly. Hurling taunts about her lofty ideals, those grand dreams she'd dared to hold of reshaping a broken world, and sneered at what they called her arrogance for believing she could ever make a dent in their iron grip. Each venomous word landed like a blow, stoking the embers of rage deep within her chest, a fire that roared louder with every insult. But her hands were bound, her body bruised. And her strength waning, she was a prisoner to their malice, powerless to strike back or shield herself from the onslaught. Her anger churned, a storm trapped within a fragile shell. Yet there was nothing she could do but endure. As her consciousness flickered, teetering on the edge of oblivion, they seized her limp form, dragging her across the cracked pavement toward the shadowed outskirts of the desolate lot. The ground scraped against her skin, gritty and unforgiving, until they reached a gnarled, leafless tree standing like a silent sentinel against the night sky. With rough hands, they bound her ankles tightly with coarse rope, the fibers biting into her flesh, and hoisted her upside down. The world flipped violently as blood surged to her head, a throbbing, pulsating agony that drowned her senses in a crimson tide. Her vision spun, a dizzying whirl of stars and darkness, while every inch of her body screamed with a dull, relentless ache that seemed to seep into her very bones. Time stretched into an unbearable haze, and as the hours crawled by, Lena drifted in and out of awareness, her mind a fragile thread clinging to fragments of memory. In those fleeting moments of clarity, her past rushed back to her like a lifeline she grasped with trembling hands. She saw her childhood unfold in vivid bursts, her mother's weathered face, etched with quiet resilience, toiling through endless days to keep them afloat, the whispered promises Lena had made to herself as a girl, vowing to rise above the despair that choked her city. And the fierce, unshakable resolve that had carried her forward, a beacon through every storm. These memories weren't just echoes, they were her anchor. A defiant tether to the pride that burned within her even now. No matter how helpless she felt, suspended there in the cold night air, she refused to let them snuff out her spirit. They could break her body, but her soul remained a fortress they couldn't breach. The night wore on, an endless expanse of torment and solitude. Minutes bled into hours. Each one an eternity carved from pain and isolation. Her mind, clouded by exhaustion and the relentless throb of her wounds, began to slip further into a fog where time lost all meaning. The city she'd sworn to protect, the sprawling maze of concrete and flickering lights she'd once called home, felt as remote as the faint stars glimmering above, cold and indifferent to her suffering. Her limbs grew heavy, her breath shallow, and the edges of her awareness frayed like worn fabric. She was alone, forsaken by the very place she'd fought so hard to save. And yet that spark of defiance still flickered, refusing to be extinguished. Then, in the fragile stillness of the early morning, a faint sound pierced the haze, crunching gravel under hesitant footsteps. Lena's heart jolted with a surge of panic, her battered body tensing as she struggled to peel her swollen eyelids apart. Her vision was a blurry smear of shadows, her strength a dwindling ember, and dread coiled in her gut. Had the officers returned, their silhouettes looming once more to finish what they'd begun? She braced herself, her mind racing with the terror of what might come next. But then a voice broke through, young, trembling, laced with a raw edge of shock and compassion. "Miss? Miss, are you okay?" It called out, unfamiliar yet achingly human. Lena tried to respond, to summon words from the depths of her parched throat, but all that escaped was a hoarse, broken whisper. Barely audible even to herself. She felt hands, small, unsteady, but determined, reach up to fumble with the ropes binding her ankles. The knots loosened, and her body was lowered gently to the ground. the sudden shift sending a jolt of searing pain through her limbs as blood rushed back into them. She nearly blacked out again, the world tilting violently. But through the haze she glimpsed her rescuer, a young man, his face pale and stricken, his eyes wide with horror as he took in her battered form. His hands shook as he pulled a phone from his pocket, fumbling with the buttons to dial for help. "Hold on," he stammered, his voice cracking with urgency and fear. "Help is on the way. Just hold on." Lena's mind was a swirling fog. Her body numb with exhaustion and pain, but a faint ember of relief flared within her. She'd been found. She was still alive. As the distant wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the pre-dawn silence, she let her eyelids flutter shut, surrendering to the tide of fatigue that pulled her under. Yet even as darkness claimed her, one truth blazed bright and unshakable: they would pay for this. She would rise again, fight back, and ensure every last one of them faced the consequences of their cruelty. Her recovery was a slow, grueling journey, each day a battle against the wreckage of her body and the ghosts that haunted her mind. Confined to a sterile hospital bed, Lena lay surrounded by the antiseptic scent of bleach and the soft hum of machines, her skin a map of bruises and swelling that shifted from deep purple to sickly yellow. The physical pain was a constant companion, sharp stabs when she moved, dull throbs when she rested, but the emotional wounds cut deeper, a raw, jagged ache that gnawed at her core. Every mark on her body, every twinge of agony, was a stark reminder of the forces she faced, a corrupt system so entrenched in its power that it would brutalize anyone who dared to challenge it. She'd always known her city harbored shadows, but now those shadows had claws, and they'd left their mark on her flesh. Yet even there, wrapped in the crisp, impersonal sheets of the hospital ward, Lena's spirit stood tall, an unyielding pillar amidst the rubble of her ordeal. She understood now that this fight wasn't just about courage, it demanded allies. Voices bold enough to join her in this uphill climb. The realization settled over her like a mantle, heavy but empowering. She couldn't topple this beast alone, but she wouldn't have to. And so, as the days passed, she began to weave a new thread into her resolve, a plan to gather those who shared her hunger for justice, who saw the rot beneath the city's surface and refused to look away. Teresa came every day, a steady presence in the sterile chaos of the hospital. Her friend's footsteps echoed softly against the linoleum as she approached, her arms laden with updates from the outside world and quiet words of encouragement that felt like a lifeline. Teresa's eyes blazed with outrage. Her fists clenched at her sides as she recounted the whispers circulating about Lena's attack, rumors of police brutality that no one dared speak aloud. But beneath her fury lay a tremor of worry, a fear she couldn't fully mask. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the room, Teresa leaned close, her voice dropping to a hushed, urgent whisper. "Lena, these people, they'll do anything to stop you. Anything. Are you sure this is worth it?" Her brow furrowed, her gaze searching Lena's face for doubt. Lena met her friend's eyes, her own stare steady despite the weariness that weighed down her voice. "It's worth everything, Teresa," she rasped, each word a quiet vow. "They can't scare me into silence. We have to expose them, rip the mask off their corruption and show the world what they've done. But I can't do it alone." Her words hung in the air, a call to arms wrapped in a plea, and Teresa nodded, her jaw tightening with resolve. It was in that moment, bathed in the dim glow of the hospital lamp, that they began to map out their next steps, plotting a network of allies who might stand with them against the towering wall of injustice. Lena's mind turned to the people she knew in the community, faces and names flickering through her thoughts like candles in the dark. There were activists who'd marched beside her, their voices hoarse from years of shouting into the void. Journalists who'd scribbled notes in dimly lit rooms, chasing truths the powerful wanted buried. And even a handful of officers, quiet dissenters within the department, who'd confided in her over the years, their frustration with the system simmering beneath their badges. These were the seeds of her resistance, and Teresa took up the mantle of reaching out. Her careful hands sifting through the city's undercurrents to find those who were not only trustworthy but driven by a bone-deep need for justice. Their efforts began humbly. A fragile spark struck in the shadows. A small group gathered in hushed corners, coffee shops with chipped mugs and community centers with peeling paint, their voices low and urgent as they spoke of accountability and change. Among the first to join was Mark Evans, a local activist whose name carried weight in the city's poorest neighborhoods. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. Mark had spent years working with youth programs, his hands rough from building something out of nothing for kids the system had forgotten. He'd seen the toll of police misconduct up close, teenagers harassed, families torn apart, and when Lena reached out, he didn't hesitate. "We've been fighting this battle for years, Lena," he said during one of their clandestine meetings, his eyes dark with conviction. "But with you at the helm, I think we might finally break through. You're not just a voice, you're a force." His belief in her was a steadying hand on her shoulder, a reminder that she wasn't alone. The circle grew, each new member adding depth to their fledgling rebellion. Rachel Wong, a journalist with sharp eyes and a sharper pen, joined soon after, her reputation for exposing corruption in local government preceding her like a storm. She'd been tracking Lena's journey since her election, her notebooks filled with scribbled leads and dog-eared pages, and now she sat across from Lena with a determined glint in her gaze. "People need to know the truth," Rachel said firmly, her voice cutting through the murmur of the coffee shop. "If we show them the evidence, hard, undeniable proof, they'll have no choice but to demand accountability." Her words were a promise, her presence a weapon honed for the fight ahead. To Lena's quiet astonishment, even a few officers from within the department stepped forward, their courage cloaked in caution. One of them, Malik Grant, approached her through a mutual contact. His broad frame hunched nervously as they met in a dimly lit park. A lower-ranking officer with tired eyes and a voice that barely rose above a whisper. Malik carried the weight of years spent watching the department's underbelly fester. "I've seen things that shouldn't happen," he confessed, his hands twisting together as he spoke. "I want to help, but if they find out, I'm finished." Lena nodded, her gaze softening with understanding. "Your safety comes first," she assured him, her tone firm yet gentle. "But what you know could be the key. You can show us the cracks from the inside." Malik's shoulders squared slightly, a flicker of resolve breaking through his fear, and with his help, they began to peel back the layers of the department's rot, a culture of intimidation, unchecked power, and a suffocating code of silence that crushed anyone who dared to defy it. Malik's stories painted a grim picture. Officers were drilled to place loyalty to the department above all else, even if it meant turning a blind eye to brutality or corruption. "Question the status quo, and you're blacklisted," he murmured one night, his breath fogging in the chilly air. "They'll hound you, make your life a living hell until you either conform or quit." His words were a window into the machine they were up against, and Lena listened intently, her mind cataloging every detail as their plan took shape. Weeks turned into months. And their group worked in the shadows, tireless and unrelenting. They met in secret, their footsteps muffled by the hum of the city, gathering scraps of evidence like pieces of a shattered mosaic. Rachel tapped her network of sources, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she chased leads. Mark and Teresa rallied the community, their voices weaving a web of quiet support. And Malik fed them insights, his courage growing with each whispered revelation. Testimonies piled up, accounts from citizens who'd felt the sting of police overreach. Documents smuggled from forgotten filing cabinets, and slowly, meticulously, they built a case not just against the officers who'd attacked Lena, but against the sprawling corruption that propped them up. The city remained largely oblivious, its pulse steady and unknowing, but whispers began to ripple through the streets. Lena's absence from the public eye, once a constant figure of hope, stirred questions. The mayor, battered but unbroken, had vanished from view since that brutal night. And the void she left behind fueled rumors that refused to die. Something was brewing, something vast and unstoppable, and though the community didn't yet know the full scope of her fight, the air crackled with the promise of reckoning. Through it all, Lena carried a lesson carved into her very being. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from above, it was a fire forged in the crucible of sacrifice and defiance. And the consequences of power unchecked? They were a debt that demanded payment. A truth she'd ensure the world could no longer ignore. On a chilly evening, the faint hum of a flickering bulb cast uneven shadows across a cramped, dimly lit room where Lena and her small band of allies gathered. Teresa, ever the diplomat, spent her days fielding a barrage of calls from anxious citizens. Her voice smooth as silk yet deliberately elusive. She offered them hollow comforts, vague promises that everything was under control, while deftly sidestepping the ugly truth gnawing at her conscience. Each conversation left her more drained, her carefully crafted mask of calm slipping as the weight of their discoveries pressed harder against her resolve. Meanwhile, Lena, seated at the head of the table, traced the grain of the worn wood with her fingertip, her mind racing. She looked up. Her gaze sweeping across the faces of her companions, each one etched with a mix of weariness, fear, and unyielding determination. "We're getting closer," she said. Her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of urgency that betrayed her calm exterior. "But let me be clear, this is going to get messier, uglier, before we see any light at the end. When we go public, they'll come for us, smear our names, threaten our lives, maybe worse. If anyone's having second thoughts, now's the time to walk away." Her words hung heavy in the air. The silence that followed thick with unspoken doubts and flickering courage. One by one, her allies responded. Rachel, the sharp-witted journalist with ink-stained fingers and a fire in her eyes, gave a curt nod, her jaw tight as if bracing for a storm. Mark, the community organizer whose broad shoulders seemed to carry the weight of every injustice he'd witnessed, murmured a quiet, "I'm in," his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. Malik, the insider from the police department, leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes glinting with a mix of defiance and exhaustion as he whispered, "You know I'm not backing down." Their resolve was palpable, a fragile yet fierce thread binding them together in this shadowed corner of a city suffocating under corruption's grip. They all understood the stakes, how exposing the rot within the police force could cost them everything, but the shared hunger for justice outweighed their fears. Lena felt a swell of gratitude, tinged with guilt, knowing she was asking them to step into the line of fire alongside her. In the days that followed, their quiet rebellion blossomed. The group expanded cautiously, pulling in new faces, ordinary people with extraordinary courage, who slipped into their ranks like whispers on the wind. There was Sarah, a soft-spoken librarian with a knack for digging up forgotten records, her hands trembling as she handed over a stack of yellowed complaints she'd unearthed from dusty archives. Then came James, a wiry mechanic whose calloused fingers typed out encrypted messages to rally support, his gruff exterior hiding a heart bruised by years of watching his neighborhood crumble. Each newcomer brought something vital, skills, secrets, stories, that wove into the fabric of their cause. They met in backrooms and basements, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and the buzz of whispered plans, forging a bond as tight as family. Lena watched this fragile coalition grow, her chest tightening with both pride and dread. She knew every step forward dragged them deeper into danger, but the fire in her gut, the memory of fists crashing against her body, the sneers of those officers who thought they'd silenced her, kept her pushing forward. Their strategy took shape over late-night debates, the table littered with crumpled notes and half-empty mugs. Rachel, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, argued passionately for a multi-pronged assault on the public's awareness. "We hit them from all angles," she insisted, her voice sharp with conviction. "Drop the evidence to every news outlet at once, flood the airwaves so they can't bury it." Her eyes gleamed with the thrill of the chase, but beneath her bravado, Lena saw the flicker of exhaustion. The toll of sleepless nights spent chasing leads. Mark, ever the pragmatist, leaned forward, his thick brows furrowed. "We need the people with us, Lena. I'll start pulling folks together, block by block, meeting by meeting. They've got to see this isn't just your fight, it's theirs too." His hands clenched into fists. A quiet fury simmering beneath his steady tone as he recalled the faces of neighbors who'd suffered in silence. Malik, meanwhile, scribbled notes in a tattered notebook. His insider's knowledge a lifeline. "They're already paranoid in there," he said, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "I can tell you exactly who'll crack first when the heat turns up." His casual demeanor masked the tightrope he walked daily, feeding them intel while dodging suspicion from his colleagues. Lena listened. Her confidence swelling even as the bruises on her arms faded to faint shadows. The night of her attack replayed in her mind with cruel clarity, the sharp sting of knuckles. The guttural laughter of men drunk on power, the cold pavement biting into her skin. That memory wasn't just a scar, it was fuel. A relentless drive to dismantle the system that had shielded her assailants. She could still feel the ache in her ribs, hear the echo of their taunts. But now those echoes were drowned out by the growing chorus of voices around her. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about every soul crushed under the weight of unchecked authority. Every plea ignored, every life discarded. The stakes were dizzying, but the coalition they'd built felt like a force of nature, unstoppable and righteous. As their evidence piled up, dog-eared documents, shaky voice recordings, sworn statements from trembling witnesses, the truth grew too monstrous to ignore. What started as a personal vendetta had unraveled into a sprawling tapestry of corruption, officers who ruled the streets like petty tyrants, a department that buried complaints under red tape. A culture that rewarded brutality with a wink and a nod. Rachel hunched over her laptop in the corner, her fingers flying across the keys as she stitched together the most damning threads. "We've got to play this smart," she said one night, her voice hoarse from hours of debate. "Dump it all at once, and people might tune out, too much noise. But if we drip it out, piece by piece, we'll keep them hooked." Her eyes burned with a mix of dread and excitement, knowing the power of the story she was crafting. Mark nodded, rubbing his stubbled chin. "The community's ready to snap. Lena. If we time this right, they'll march with us. But we've got to watch our backs, the department's not going to just roll over." His words carried the weight of a man who'd seen too many promises broken, yet still clung to hope. Their plan crystallized into a slow-burn campaign, a series of calculated leaks. Each one a hammer blow to the department's facade. The first strike landed with a story in the city's most trusted paper, a meticulously detailed exposé on 2 officers. The same ones who'd left Lena battered in an alley. The article laid bare years of complaints, broken bones dismissed as resisting arrest, racial slurs shrugged off, misconduct swept under the rug. Rachel's media savvy ensured it hit like a thunderclap, spreading through the city overnight. By morning, knots of furious residents gathered outside City Hall. Their handmade signs trembling in the wind, * no more lies, justice now. * the air crackled with raw, unfiltered rage. A pent-up storm of frustration from people who'd lived too long in fear of the badges meant to protect them. Lena stood at the edge of the crowd, her coat pulled tight against the chill. Her heart pounding with a chaotic blend of vindication and unease. She'd expected a reaction, but this was a tidal wave. The department hit back fast. Chief Mayo Clinic. A barrel-chested man with a politician's smile and a dictator's grip, took to the podium, his voice booming with false indignation. "These are baseless attacks," he declared. His jowls quivering as he waved off the accusations. "The media's spinning fairy tales to divide us. My officers are honorable, law-abiding servants of this city." His denial rang hollow to anyone paying attention, but it stoked the loyalty of his inner circle. Inside the precinct, the mood grew brittle. Officers who'd thrived under Mayo's reign traded nervous glances, their bravado cracking as whispers of an internal probe slithered through the ranks. Some doubled down. Clinging to the blue wall of silence like a lifeline, others started edging away, their careers flashing before their eyes. Rachel countered with a second salvo, a gut punch of a story laced with first-hand accounts from the department's victims. There was Maria. A grandmother whose grandson had been roughed up for looking suspicious, her voice breaking as she recounted, begging for answers that never came. There was Jamal. A shop owner who'd been shaken down for years, his quiet dignity a stark contrast to the shame in his words. Each testimony was a brick in the wall of evidence. A cry that echoed through the city streets. The protests swelled, spilling into intersections, the chants of the crowd a drumbeat of defiance. Lena watched it unfold, her throat tight with emotion. This was justice taking root, not the clean, tidy kind from storybooks, but the messy, painful kind forged in anger and loss. The turning point came late one night. When a young officer named Daniel Torres reached out to Rachel through a burner phone, his voice a ragged whisper. They met in a dingy diner, the air thick with grease and tension. His uniform swapped for a hoodie that did little to hide his jittery hands. Daniel had been there the night Lena was attacked, a reluctant bystander, frozen as his colleagues unleashed their fury. They laughed about it, he confessed, his eyes darting to the window as if expecting retribution. Said she needed to learn her place. I just stood there, watching the street, too scared to move. I hate myself for it. His shoulders slumped under the weight of his guilt, a young man caught between loyalty and conscience, unraveling under the pressure of a city on fire. Rachel listened. Her recorder humming softly, her face a mask of solemn understanding. You're doing something brave now, Daniel, she said, her tone gentle but firm. This isn't just about Lena, it's about stopping a machine that's been crushing people for years. His confession was the keystone they'd been missing, a first-hand account that tied the officers to the attack with cold, undeniable clarity. Rachel's next article hit the presses at dawn. And the city erupted. Daniel's words, raw, halting, human, cut through the noise, validating every whispered rumor, every buried grievance. Crowds surged outside the precinct. Their voices a roar that rattled the windows. Lena stood with her team, watching the chaos unfold, her scars tingling as if in recognition of the moment. The lesson was searing and clear: power, when wielded without accountability, rotted everything it touched. But consequence, the slow, grinding wheel of justice, was finally turning, driven by the courage of those who dared to speak. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Lena felt the ground shifting beneath the corrupt edifice they'd vowed to topple. The city pulsed with a restless energy. A simmering blend of hope and dread that coursed through its streets like a living thing. Crowds spilled out into the open, their voices rising in a cacophony of chants, raw and unrelenting. Demanding justice with every shouted syllable. Homemade signs bobbed above their heads, bold letters scrawled with pleas for accountability. Their edges fraying in the wind but their message unwavering. From her hospital room, Lena gazed out through the smudged glass. Her chest swelling with a fierce gratitude that tangled with an ironclad resolve. Tubes snaked across her arms, a constant reminder of the brutality she'd endured. Yet her spirit burned brighter than ever. This moment, this outpouring of public fury, was a triumph she'd clawed her way toward. A crack in the wall of silence that had shielded the corrupt for too long. But she knew, deep in her bones, that her battle was only beginning. The truth was out now. A wildfire the people wouldn't let die, and she felt its heat fueling her every breath. The city's response had ignited overnight, a spark turned inferno. And it forced the powers at City Hall to act. Under the crushing weight of irrefutable evidence and the unrelenting roar of the masses, they announced a formal investigation into the police department. The news crackled through the airwaves, a begrudging concession from a system unused to bending. At the precinct, Chief Mayo Clinic stepped before a cluster of microphones, his face a mask of practiced calm that faltered at the edges. A faint sheen of sweat glistened on his brow, betraying the unease gnawing at him. "The department will cooperate fully," he declared, his voice ringing hollow, each word a carefully placed stone in a crumbling dam. To those who knew him, it was obvious, he was floundering, a man watching his empire of control slip through his fingers. For years, he'd cultivated an image of unassailable authority. A king atop a throne built on secrets and fear. Now, that throne was trembling, and the cracks spidering through its foundation were impossible to ignore. Lena's allies pressed forward, relentless as hounds on a scent. Rachel, with her sharp mind and journalist's tenacity, pored over files late into the night, her desk a chaos of coffee mugs and scribbled notes. Malik, the insider who'd risked everything to turn on his own, brought a quiet intensity to their efforts, his knowledge of the department's inner workings a map through its darkest corners. Together, they unearthed more than just isolated abuses of power, they uncovered a sprawling machinery of corruption, oiled and maintained by those who thrived in its shadows. Rachel's breakthrough came in the form of a cache of confidential emails, each one a dagger of truth. She spread the printed pages across a rickety table in their makeshift headquarters, her voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "These aren't just mistakes," she said, tapping the papers with a finger. "This is a blueprint, cold, deliberate corruption. Mayo Clinic and his inner circle orchestrated it all, burying complaints, twisting evidence, discrediting anyone who dared speak up. They built a shield around their own. And they've been hiding behind it for years." Malik leaned over the table, his broad shoulders tense, his dark eyes scanning the words that damned his former colleagues. His jaw tightened, a storm brewing behind his usually steady gaze. "This isn't negligence," he muttered, his voice low and rough. "It's a conspiracy, plain and simple. They've been playing puppet master, pulling strings to keep their power intact, no matter who got crushed underfoot." Lena's fingers traced the lines of text, her anger rising like a tide. The emails were sterile, clinical. Their tone devoid of remorse, a chilling testament to how far these men would go to protect their dominion. Yet, in their cold precision, she saw something else, a weapon. This was the key to dismantling the facade, to dragging the rot into the light where it could no longer fester. "We're done hiding," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade, steady despite the fire raging inside her. "The people deserve to see this, all of it." Rachel's eyes gleamed with determination as she nodded, already mapping out their next move. "We'll leak it to the press, every major outlet at once. Flood the channels so they can't smother it. And we'll back it up with voices from the community, leaders who'll stand with us. This isn't just about you, Lena, it's about every soul they've silenced." Over the next few days, the team became a whirlwind of action. Rachel dialed her contacts, her voice firm yet persuasive as she secured promises of coverage. Malik lingered in the shadows, his presence a quiet anchor, offering insights into how the department might counterattack and suggesting ways to sharpen their revelations. Mark, the burly activist with a heart as big as his frame, rallied local leaders, his booming laugh echoing through tense planning sessions as he organized a press conference to amplify their strike. Meanwhile, Lena, confined to her sterile hospital bed, coordinated it all. Her mind racing even as her body demanded rest. When the day of the release dawned, the city held its breath. Lena watched, her heart pounding against her ribs. As the story erupted across screens and headlines. The emails, those damning threads of deceit, splashed across every news feed, their contents laid bare for all to see. Police chief implicated in years-long cover-up, the bold letters screamed, and the public's reaction was a thunderclap. Crowds swelled outside City Hall, their chants a relentless drumbeat, calling for Mayo Clinic's head and a reckoning for the department that had betrayed them. Signs waved like battle flags, and the air crackled with a fury that refused to be ignored. Clinic scrambled to respond, his press conference a desperate bid to salvage his sinking ship. Standing stiffly at the podium, he insisted the emails were misinterpreted. His words dripping with indignation as he accused the media of sensationalism. But the crowd wasn't buying it. His once commanding presence shrank under the weight of their skepticism. And as he retreated from the microphones, the jeers followed him like a shadow. Inside City Hall, the pressure reached a boiling point. Lena's allies within its walls, council members who'd long suspected the truth, seized the moment, arguing passionately in an emergency meeting. "The people won't stand for half measures," one insisted. Her voice ringing with conviction. "Clinic has to go, and the department needs a full overhaul, independent, transparent, no excuses." By nightfall, the verdict was in, Mayo Clinic was sidelined. Placed on administrative leave, and a handful of officers named in the emails were suspended, their badges stripped pending further scrutiny. The news raced through the city, and Lena, propped against her pillows, felt a quiet satisfaction bloom within her. The system she'd once thought untouchable was buckling, its weaknesses exposed by the very people it had failed. Yet she tempered her triumph with caution. This was a victory, yes, but the roots of corruption ran deeper than one man, and uprooting them would take more than a single blow. In the days that followed, the momentum only grew. Rachel's articles poured forth, each one a meticulous dissection of cases the department had swept under the rug, stories of victims ignored. Complaints lost in bureaucratic limbo, lives shattered by indifference. Her words painted a vivid, gut-wrenching picture, and the city devoured them, hungry for truth. Mark's community forums became a lifeline, packed with residents whose voices trembled with rage and sorrow as they recounted their own brushes with a system that had turned its back on them. Malik, ever the silent force, fed them strategies, his calm demeanor a steadying hand amid the storm. The movement swelled, no longer just about Lena's attack but a citywide cry for justice. A demand that the old ways be torn down and rebuilt. One evening, as dusk painted the hospital window in hues of gold, Lena's phone buzzed with a message from Teresa, a community organizer whose quiet strength had bolstered their cause. Clinic resigned, it read, simple yet seismic. They couldn't shield him anymore. Lena's breath caught. A wave of vindication washing over her. His resignation was a symbol, a chink in the armor of a system that had grown fat on its own arrogance. But she knew the fight was far from won. The department would dig in its heels, clinging to its rotting foundations even as the people hammered at its walls. With a pen trembling slightly in her hand, she began sketching out plans, reforms to cement accountability, policies to guard against the abuses she'd suffered. The road ahead loomed long and treacherous, lined with those who'd fight tooth and nail to preserve their privilege. Yet, for the first time, hope flickered within her, bright and unyielding. That night, as she drifted into a rare, peaceful sleep, the city thrummed with a new vitality. Beyond her window, people of every stripe gathered, their voices rising in unison, a chorus of defiance and dreams. Lena stepped onto the steps of City Hall days later, her body frail but her spirit a beacon, surrounded by allies who'd become family. The crowd stretched before her. A sea of faces united by a shared resolve. She felt the weight of their trust, the burden of battles yet to come, but also the strength of what they'd already achieved. Justice, she realized, wasn't a gift bestowed from on high, it was a fire stoked by the fearless, a lesson carved from the ashes of power abused. And as she looked out, she knew she'd keep fighting, not just for herself, but for them all. Amid the sea of faces stretching out before her, Lena's gaze settled on those who had stood by her side from the very first spark of resistance: Teresa, Mark, Rachel, and Malik. Each one had wagered something dear, time, safety, reputations, to align with her cause. Together, they had taken a solitary stand, a flicker of rebellion against a suffocating system, and fanned it into a blazing movement that now rippled through the city streets. They had dared to prove that even beneath the weight of corruption and power, transformation could take root. As Lena drew a slow, steady breath, her boots clicked against the weathered wood of the podium. The clamor of the crowd softened, a hush falling like a blanket as hundreds of eyes locked onto her. Her chest tightened with a swell of emotion, pride, fear, gratitude all tangled together, as she prepared to speak. Knowing her voice would carry not just to her steadfast companions but to the countless souls who had long felt invisible, their cries swallowed by an uncaring world. "Thank you for standing here with me," she began, her words slicing through the air with a clarity forged in the fires of everything she'd endured. "Today, we're not just a scattering of individuals. We're a community, woven together by a dream of justice, a demand for accountability, and a hunger for respect. What happened to me wasn't merely an assault on one woman, it was a strike against the very ideals we cherish. It was a glaring reminder of the arrogance some wield, believing they can lord over us without consequence. But today, we turn that lesson back on them. We declare that they answer to us, the people." The crowd erupted. A thunderous wave of cheers and clapping hands rolling through the streets like a storm breaking loose. Lena paused, her lips parting in a faint smile as she let the raw energy settle, the sound reverberating in her bones. "For far too long," she continued, her voice rising with a steady fire, "corruption and abuse have festered in the shadows, cloaked by a system built to shield the powerful from the reckoning they deserve. But together, we've dragged that darkness into the light. We've shown we won't cower, won't retreat, and won't settle for anything less than a city that serves its people." The air exploded again with shouts of agreement, a chorus of voices lifting her words higher. Lena's eyes caught the glint of tears on Teresa's face, the woman's hands clasped tightly as if holding on to this moment. Mark stood tall beside her, his jaw set with a quiet resolve that had carried them through sleepless nights of planning. Rachel's gaze burned with a fierce pride, while Malik nodded slowly, his usual guarded demeanor softened by the weight of their shared victory. This wasn't just Lena's triumph, it belonged to them all, a testament to the sacrifices they'd poured into this fight. In the days after the mayor's reluctant resignation, a man whose downfall had been hastened by their relentless pressure, Lena and her allies threw themselves into the grueling work of rewriting the city's future. They gathered in dimly lit rooms, papers strewn across tables littered with coffee cups, drafting reforms to dismantle the police department's rotten core and rebuild trust with a public that had been betrayed too long. Their proposals were bold, reaching into every crevice of the institution: revamped training to root out bias and teach officers to defuse rather than dominate, stricter hiring standards to weed out those drawn to power over service, and ironclad oversight to ensure no misdeed went unchecked. One of their earliest victories was the creation of an independent committee, a group of community stalwarts, fiery activists, and everyday citizens granted the authority to dig into complaints, probe misconduct, and demand discipline when the badge was abused. It was a beacon of transparency, a promise that the people's voices wouldn't be drowned out anymore. The changes didn't come without a fight. Some officers bristled, their egos wounded by what they saw as an attack on their dominion. Others clung to the old ways like sailors to a sinking ship, grumbling that accountability would shackle them, render them toothless. A handful even stormed out, tossing their badges in protest, snarling that the department was going soft. But Lena stood unshaken. She knew justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a garden cultivated through tough choices, through letting go of a past that had failed them all. Under her steady hand, City Hall began pouring resources into forgotten corners of the city. New community centers rose from cracked asphalt, their doors flung open to offer kids a place to dream after school, to provide counseling for weary minds, and to teach skills that could lift families from despair. Parks, once overrun with weeds and neglect, bloomed anew, safe havens where laughter replaced the echoes of sirens, where neighbors swapped stories instead of suspicions. The city wasn't perfect, not yet, but it pulsed with a fragile, defiant hope. The Oversight Committee wasted no time proving its mettle. Cases that once would have been buried, brushed off with a shrug or a falsified report, were hauled into the open. Investigations unfolded under the public's watchful eye, each step a brick in the wall of accountability. For the first time, people felt the system bend toward them, not against them. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the skyline in hues of gold, Lena wandered through streets that had once bristled with hostility. Children darted through a refurbished park, their squeals mingling with the chatter of families gathered for a potluck. An old man waved from a bench, his smile crinkling the lines of a face that had seen too much hardship. The city wasn't healed, but it was breathing, alive with possibility where fear had once reigned. She stopped at the edge of a familiar park. The one where she'd pounded the dirt trails in the gray dawn, where she'd first felt the cold prickle of danger from those who wanted her silenced. Her eyes drifted to the gnarled oak she knew too well, the tree she'd been bound to on that night when terror had clawed at her throat. The memory surged back, the rough bark biting into her wrists. The sneers of her attackers, the suffocating certainty that she might not survive. But now, standing there, she felt something else, a quiet swell of pride, a peace that settled deep. She hadn't just endured, she'd turned that pain into a force that reshaped the city she'd always called home. The next morning, Lena found herself on a modest stage at a citywide gathering. A celebration of the ground they'd gained and the grit of those who'd refused to break. She looked out over a mosaic of faces, some weathered from years of struggle, others bright with the fire of youth. Teresa stood near the front, her arms crossed but her eyes shining with a rare softness. Mark lingered at the edge, scribbling notes for their next move. Ever the strategist. Rachel clapped with a fervor that shook her whole frame, while Malik leaned against a post, his quiet nod speaking volumes. Today, we don't gather as victims, Lena said. Her voice warm yet unyielding, threading through the crowd like a lifeline. We stand as survivors, people who wouldn't be hushed, who faced down injustice, and who demanded more for ourselves. Our loved ones, our city. This road hasn't been smooth, and there's a long stretch ahead, but right now, we celebrate what we've built together and the strength that binds us. The crowd roared. A sound that lifted her heart and anchored her resolve. The reforms she'd bled for were taking hold, the city beginning to mirror the values she'd clung to through every storm. It was a victory, yes. But also a call to keep pushing. Challenges loomed, those who'd dig in their heels, who'd scheme to claw back power, but Lena was ready. As the cheers faded, she scanned the faces before her. A renewed purpose igniting in her chest. Our story doesn't end here, she said, her tone brimming with defiance. More hurdles will come, more battles. But together, we'll face them all. The lesson was clear, justice wasn't a gift from above, it was a fire stoked by the people, and the misuse of power would always meet its reckoning in the hands of those who refused to bow. The air crackled with energy as the crowd roared, their voices crashing like waves against the shore, a thunderous symphony of hope and defiance. Lena stood at the heart of it all. Her chest swelling with a fierce, unshakable pride. Together, they were an unstoppable force, united by a dream so vivid it seemed to shimmer in the air. A city where justice wasn't just a hollow promise scratched onto paper, but a living, breathing truth. A place where every soul, regardless of the color of their skin, the shape of their identity, or the shadows of their past, would be met with the dignity and respect they were born to claim. The cheers reverberated through her bones, and as she gazed out at the sea of faces, each one alight with the same fire that burned in her, Lena felt a certainty settle deep within her. This wasn't the end of a journey, it was the dawn of something monumental. A beginning she had poured her entire life into crafting. In the weeks that followed, the city seemed to hum with a new rhythm, as if it, too, had caught the fever of their shared vision. Fresh policies unfurled like banners of progress, and programs sprang to life, each one a brick laid in the foundation of something greater. Lena watched it all unfold with a quiet awe, her heart thrumming with a mixture of joy and disbelief. The streets, once heavy with silence and suspicion, now buzzed with voices, neighbors greeting one another. Children laughing as they darted through newly built parks, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops with a renewed sense of purpose. The community was knitting itself together, thread by thread. Growing stronger, more vibrant, more alive. For Lena, it was like watching a wilted flower bloom after a long, brutal winter. She carried the scars of her past like medals etched into her skin, marks of the battles she'd fought, the nights she'd spent clawing her way out of despair. Once, those scars had throbbed with pain, a constant echo of the darkness she'd endured. Now, they were a quiet source of power, a testament to her survival, a reminder that she hadn't just endured, she had risen. Each morning, Lena walked the city streets with a steady, purposeful stride, her head lifted high, her eyes tracing the skyline as it shifted and grew. The cobblestones beneath her feet felt like old friends, worn smooth by time and struggle, yet solid enough to carry her forward. Her presence was a quiet force, a beacon to those who crossed her path. Shopkeepers would pause to nod in respect, their weathered faces softening with gratitude. Young mothers would clutch their children a little closer, whispering tales of the woman who'd fought for them all. Even the stray dogs seemed to sense her resolve, trotting alongside her for a few steps before scampering off into the alleys. She could feel the weight of her mission in every breath. The work was far from done, and the road ahead loomed with challenges she couldn't yet name. But fear had no hold on her anymore. She was ready, her spirit forged in fire, her will as unyielding as the city she'd vowed to protect. This place belonged to her, to them, and together, they would keep pushing upward, defying gravity itself. Lena's fight had begun years ago, in a time when the city was a different beast, a sprawling, jagged maze of corruption and neglect. She'd been a nobody then. Just another face swallowed by the crowd, her voice drowned out by the clamor of those who wielded power like a club. Back then, justice was a luxury, doled out to the few who could afford it, while the rest were left to scrape by in its shadow. She remembered the sting of that inequity, the way it had gnawed at her soul every time she saw a child go hungry, or a worker collapse under the weight of an unfair wage, or a family evicted from a home they'd poured their lives into. It wasn't just the pain of others that drove her, it was her own. The memory of cold, sleepless nights, of fists pounding against her door, of a system that had turned its back on her when she'd needed it most. That was the crucible where her resolve had been born. A spark of anger that grew into a blazing inferno. She hadn't done it alone, though. There was Marcus, the grizzled old baker whose hands were as rough as the bread he needed, but whose heart beat with a stubborn, quiet faith in her cause. He'd been the first to stand with her, his gravelly voice cutting through the murmurs of doubt at that first meeting in the damp basement of his shop. "If we don't fight now," he'd said, his eyes glinting with a fire that belied his years, "then we're just handing our kids a cage." Then there was Aisha, a young seamstress with a quick laugh and a quicker mind, who'd spent countless nights stitching banners and dreaming up slogans that would rally the masses. Aisha's fingers trembled sometimes, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of her hope. A hope she'd confided to Lena one evening as they sat hunched over a flickering candle. I want my little brother to grow up free, not just alive. These were the souls who'd breathed life into Lena's vision, who'd turned her solitary crusade into a movement that shook the city to its core. The transformation didn't come without cost. There were days when the air hung heavy with tension, when old powers reared their heads, snarling and snapping like cornered beasts. Lena remembered the night they'd tried to silence her, a shadowed figure slipping through the crowd, a glint of steel catching the moonlight. She'd felt the cold brush of danger against her skin, her pulse hammering as she dodged the blade by inches. The attacker had vanished into the night, but the message lingered: power doesn't yield without a fight. Yet every blow they landed only sharpened her resolve, every threat only steeled the spines of those who stood with her. The lesson was clear, etched into the very streets they walked. Justice isn't given, it's taken, forged through sweat and sacrifice, and guarded with vigilance. Those who abused their authority, who preyed on the weak, would face consequences, not just in the courts they'd once controlled, but in the eyes of a city that had learned to see them for what they were. Lena's courage rippled outward. A stone dropped into still water, stirring waves that reached far beyond her own life. It wasn't just her city that changed, it was the people within it. A teenage boy, once resigned to a life of petty theft, now spent his afternoons hauling bricks for a new community center, his shoulders squared with a pride he'd never known. An elderly woman, her voice long silenced by fear, stood at a podium one crisp evening, her trembling hands gripping a megaphone as she demanded clean water for her block. Strangers became allies, allies became family. And a city once fractured by greed and apathy began to heal. Lena's story wasn't hers alone anymore, it belonged to every soul who'd dared to believe, who'd risen from their knees to demand something better. Her fight had taught them all a truth as old as the earth itself: when power is wielded without mercy, it plants the seeds of its own ruin. And when justice takes root, it grows wild and unstoppable, a force no tyrant can contain.